Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and welcome back to Season 3 of Energy vs. Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy vs. Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. On today's show, we're back after a summer of hell and high water to unpack what moved the dial on climate and energy while we're on hiatus. We also look at this week's climate and energy news and preview what's to come this season of Energy versus Climate, from geopolitics to energy storage, health impacts, just transition, and more. Here's the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 1 of Energy vs. Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith. We're back, and we're very happy to be back. We've got a new format that we're going to run today for today's webinar and podcast. So I'm just going to give you a few updates of things that happened over the summer. Each of us, David, Sarah, and I brought a climate story or stories from the past week or so. We're going to unpack that for 15 minutes or so. And then we're going to do a go-round. What moved the dial on climate and energy this past summer? There's lots of things that happened. We're going to unpack some of those. And we'll move to a Q&A for 15 minutes. And as always, we've got the wonderful Mika McFarland back. Thank you, Mika, to help us to collect your questions. So, without any further ado, Sarah, you've got some news from this past summer. You've got a new position and a new program.
That's right. I am a fully fledged assistant professor, and I am now directing the Sustainable Energy Development Master's Program at the University of Calgary. So SEDV is a professional master's program, and I think of it as like the professional master's version of Energy versus Climate. We cover a lot of the same topics, looking at the changing energy system. So it's a great place to be, and I'm really excited about it.
That is awesome. SEDV, Sustainable Energy Development Program. If someone were to be interested in that program, what do they do?
They can send me a note. So you can find out more on the UCalgary website about the program. The application season is actually opening up soon for that.
That's great. And for months, I've been calling Sarah professor on energy versus climate. And offline she'd say, well, yeah, sure. I've got a doctorate, but I'm not actually a professor. Now I don't have to censor myself. You are a professor, and congrats on the new position.
Thanks.
Yeah. And the other news from the team is, David, you've got a new background. You're not in Canmore anymore.
I am not in Canmore anymore after, I left Cambridge in March 2020 for a week of spring break in Canmore, and I stayed for a year and a half. I came back about 4 weeks ago, and I got to say it's been extraordinarily, just amazingly energizing being in front of students. So actually, I'm teaching an energy systems course. I actually wasn't that keen to teach. There was some dean level people twisting my arm. And yet, despite that, actually being in front of 36 or so super amazing students was just so energizing. So it's really felt good to be back here. To talk about COVID for a second, it's interesting to see what a big institution like this can do. So Harvard has built a system of testing with PCR tests. I get one weekly, but you can get it basically as often as you want, self-administered, 24-hour turnaround. Undergraduates, I think, get it every other day now. There's a very comprehensive system. Everybody's masked inside, but people really are inside. And then lots of tents set out all over Harvard where people can do meetings outside without masks. So it's really amazing how close to kind of normal life it is. And to talk about my class for a second, this course I kind of didn't want to teach. I'm now loving teaching again. It's my energy systems course that I really first built up at UCalgary. And it's called Energy Within Environmental Constraints. And there's a edX, MOOC, massive online version of it. And this semester, actually 120,000 or something people are taking the MOOC version. And we've got 36 or so, as I said, in my Harvard version. But I am for the first time trying what professors now call flipped classroom, the full flipped classroom, where in general, I don't do almost any straight lecturing in class. What I do is get them to watch the videos from edX, assigning specific videos, And then I get them to post questions or do problems and stuff in class, or I do little supplemental lecturing, but really trying to do the flipped classroom based on the evidence that professors just standing up and droning on doesn't actually work that well for education. So it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be a record for a MOOC. You have over 100,000 people taking it. Seems like you need a cadre of teachers' assistants. But I know that's not the way that MOOCs work.
There is serious support that edX does. I'm not really involved aside from now I'm talking about improving the thing because there's lots of things that are out of date. Like our solar pricing is 2014 numbers and they're all wrong. But I don't think I'm near a record. I think there are ones that are much bigger. Gotcha.
Okay. Well, great to have you joining from Cambridge. So I have no new position or change in location, but we do have some updates because we're busy over the summer. We had sent out an online survey. Thanks to all of you who responded to it. We got your suggestions for more news coverage, industry case studies. We're going to try to work on in-depth show notes. So watch out for those this season. We also revamped our website. So check out energyversusclimate.com. We've got a new Twitter handle at energyversusclimate. You can check out the site, follow us on Twitter. And the new site, I will plug, it allows us to take tax-deductible donations from all of you, our loyal listeners and watchers, and that really helps us to produce the show. David, Sara, and I, we don't take any fees, any remuneration for the show. It's a gig of passion and a volunteer gig, but we do have hard production costs. And if you feel inclined to help us to pay for those production costs, we'd really appreciate it. And we actually got our first donation with the new site. John, you know who you are. Thank you again. Last thing is we changed, yes, thumbs up to John. We changed our email provider because of the new site. So all of you, you're here, you're obviously getting it. If you know of others, please help them to check their spam folders or promotion folders if you haven't been getting our invites. All right. So based on listener feedback, we've added a new and newsworthy segment. And today, in the absence of a guest, we're going to probably spend a bit more time on it than we will when we get into shows with guests. So all of us are going to bring forward a story, and we're going to talk about its significance. So Sara, over to you for the first new and newsworthy story.
Great. It was hard to pick one, but I decided to go with the news that the House Oversight Committee in the U.S. is calling leaders from some of the top oil and gas companies to discuss their role in spreading disinformation about the role of fossil fuels and the link to global warming and climate change. And so this is starting up and happening. I think it's interesting and potentially impactful. People have noted, it is modeled on the tobacco inquiry that happened, previously, looking at sort of a similar question of the role of tobacco executives on muddying the waters on the science of tobacco and lung cancer. And so, I just hear what Ed and David think too, as well as, is this significant? Is it really going to is it the beginning of a kind of reckoning for the impact that some of that disinformation had? Because there is, I think, an increasing number, starting with the earliest I'm familiar with, at least this Merchants of Doubt work, but continuing with the work of on the podcast Drilled, for example, with Amy and her reporting, and we'll put links to all these, I think, in the show notes. But I think it's it has the potential, I think, to be really moving the conversation forward and kind of changing. That then links to things like, well, is there a financial responsibility that these companies now have? So definitely one I'm going to be watching.
As it happens, I walked by just an hour ago out of my class, Naomi and Oreskes, the author of Merchants of Doubt. We just smiled and waved at each other. I'm not sure. I think one view would be that at this point, everybody knows that the companies tried to block information. But on the other hand, they fundamentally were producing a legal product under rules. So it's not clear what the room to sue them would be.
Yeah. And I think I'm encouraged by it. I don't like it when companies lie and they get away with it. But this, I wonder, it's an old story. And as you say, there's a podcast called Drilled, which has done a very extensive job of documenting it, as Merchants of Doubt did as well. So I'm wondering what could come out of it. And I don't understand, I guess, U.S. laws well enough to know what kind of financial penalties could come out of it. It was very clear when you get to health impacts in tobacco, that much is clear to me when you're jeopardizing lives. Now, we're going to talk about this in a bit, but there's still a tougher link in certainly the eyes of politicians to draw between those companies and their misinformation campaigns and costing lives.
I think there's a tougher link, although it's getting clearer, right? So some of the advances in attribution science, and again, maybe we'll talk about that later. We used to always hear reporting that, okay, that, there was this heat wave or there was this flood and we can't, it's likely to be linked to climate change, but it can't be proved. And that has really advanced as far as using methods that really allow researchers to understand what role climate change plays in a given disaster. So I think there is a potential scope for that. I mean, we probably, to your point, is what's the legal implications for that? I think we probably need a U.S. lawyer to talk about. But I think there is the possibility to sort of take events that are happening and more closely connect them to some of this action.
So I think the change in attribution is really exciting. And just a little bit of background, I mean, the basic thing you do is you run an ensemble that is a whole bunch of climate models, 100 of them, say, and you run some of them without the CO2, but everything else being the same, the volcanoes and other stuff, and some of them with the CO2. And you look essentially at what fraction of them display the thing that happened, the heat dome or whatever. And then you can say, what was the contribution of the carbon dioxide to the heat dome, for example? And I think that's really credible science and it's grown a lot. But even if you know that accurately, that tells you what fraction is due to anthropogenic CO2. But that doesn't tell, but in order to talk about the consequence of the lies, you have to say how the lies influenced policy. And that's pretty different because there's no big question that say, if you look at Standard Oil and all its successors, you can calculate the total fraction of global CO2 that Standard Oil and its successors at 0%-ish. But it's very unclear, and I think actually not reasonable to hold Standard Oil and now Exxon liable for stuff going back through the whole industrial era.
No, and so that is a challenge, but what has become incredibly clear, and through hearings like this, through the podcast, books, and now with the IPCC, and I'll talk about this Climate Change 21, is it is very clear the explicit of the blame for climate change being on the burning of fossil fuels. And it is there is now a lot of pressure on those companies that burn those fossil fuels to reduce their emissions and I think ultimately account for them. So we might see this. We're seeing statues being torn down today, which I think should be housed in a statue museum. It's not hard to imagine in the future where CEOs have been paragons of the community, that a movement, holding them accountable for what they've done when they knew the science could cause them to, if not statues being torn down, let's say names being torn off of business schools. That's not hard to imagine.
Yeah, David, there's that forward and backwards looking as well, too. And so how does it impact climate policy going forwards and the role that these companies play? I agree with what a lot of you guys are saying as well, too.
But the tie between climate and fossil fuels is hardly new. The first New York Times reporting of the tight link between climate change and fossil fuels is in the 50s.
Correct.
So there's nothing.
Yep. David, what's your story?
I thought you were going to introduce the Harvard divestment story.
Okay. So let me introduce that. So I noticed that Harvard and its president, Lawrence Bacow, has announced that the institution has already been cutting its investments in fossil fuels, and now its investment arm, the Harvard Management Company, which oversees a very large endowment, $42 billion, that it will now start completely divesting in any companies exploring for reserves of fossil fuels. And that's, so I think it's big, but David, you were there at the outset of this when Bill McKibben and his Hardy Band students started working on this a decade ago. I remember being skeptical because McKibben had a tough time convincing his own very liberal arts college, Middlebury College, to divest. But this to me seems like it's really big news.
I'm not sure it's big news, but here's my take. So I'm a supporter. I was actually, I think, one of the first tenure faculty to stand outside the president's office and say I was supporting it. So I do. but I'm not sure how much it matters. I was supporting it because I thought it was absolutely wonderful that students were standing up and doing something, and the actual students involved. And I talked to some of the kind of earlier generation of them involved in this movement were just really impressive people. Some have gone on to really interesting careers. So I wanted to support that. I think there are two issues that are interesting to me. One is, what does it technically mean? So forgetting all the politics, if you're in Harvard Management Corporation and somebody orders you to do this, what do you actually do? There's a lot of talk about total divestment or divestment of all fossil-related emissions or making the divestment portfolio somehow carbon neutral. I have no idea what that means. I just taught in my class this morning how life cycle analysis works and showed them an economic input-output LCA tool. And in that, you can calculate what are the total emissions across all industrial sectors of, say, spending the $250,000 or whatever it costs to go to Harvard. I think that number can't be zero unless the entire emissions of the economy are zero. So I just don't know what it means to be zero in an economy that uses lots of fossil. And it's true that you can divest yourself of companies whose primary job is exploring for fossil fuels. That's the headline oil and gas companies. But in fact, they're part of a complicated network of engineering firms and financial firms that do this. And I think it's actually technically hard to know how to draw the line. So forgetting politics at all, if you're just told to divest, it's not clear to me that a financial person actually knows how to do it. A. B, I'm not sure it matters that much in terms of flows of capital. I think there's been a lot of evidence that suggests that it's very hard to see how this really produces much actual leverage in terms of making differentiated costs of capital. But there are also arguments that it does. It's complicated. I think the big question has always been political. So people on the inside, including Bill McKibben, is my impression, have at least been inside willing to say, this is fundamentally symbolic. So some of the students I talked to said, we get it, that actually divesting makes no difference in terms of flows of capital. The goal is to force a fight among people like the Harvard Board of Overseers, who are extremely powerful, well-connected people in America, that forces them to take this seriously as a way to get conversation that leads to the kind of legislative climate action we actually need to happen. So it was a kind of a pathway to get a political fight to get to legislation. And my view is that that's the credible argument, but it's not obvious to me how important it is. And there are people who want to celebrate it as a huge victory. And I think it's a good thing, but it's not obvious to me that how important it actually is.
I agree that it's nuanced. And I think we talked about this a while back when we had our episode on financing. I think to me, it's still newsworthy and matters for two reasons. So one is that I think it's a sign of the times and where things are going, right? And Ed, to your point that, it was hard to get a, relatively small liberal arts college to sign on to this initially. And now you have, large leading universities doing it is a sign. And they are not necessarily ones who are going to, frankly, stick their neck out on this kind of thing. So I think in that sense, I think some of the recent divestment announcements in the oil space are really more, people getting out in front of the parade that's happening away from a long-term future for fossil fuels. But that's still a sign of what's going on. I think the question of when does it really start to bite as far as actually impacting how hard it is to raise financing. And we may not be there yet, but something similar would have been said about coal not that long ago. And now, there was a study, I think earlier this year from Oxford that showed that the cost of capital for coal, for investment in coal is now something like 4 times higher than for renewables. So, you do eventually, as you shrink the potential pool of capital, it takes some time. And you certainly don't necessarily run out of capital, but that capital starts to get a lot more expensive. And that makes a really big difference then when you talk about the cost of, going ahead with a given project. That cost of capital is a big lever, a big contributor to that cost. So I think that, I would agree. I don't think we're there yet in the oil space, but the history of how that looks in coal, which I think arguably is there, shows that could come in the future. And then I think, maybe foreshadowing one of the other news stories is after you get to the higher cost of capital, then you finally get to you just run out of capital. So there's sort of these phases in the impacts of divestment on the ability to move forward on projects.
Yeah. And I know I go back and forth on divestment in general and wondering whether it's a nothing burger or its significance. And I think it really depends on, what's going on or what I'm feeling when I wake up in that morning. On a nothing burger, for a lot of the reasons that you said, David, it's ultimately, when you look at overall capital flows, I think it could be insignificant. But on it being a something burger, I think back to the interactions I've had with CEOs, and I think I've mentioned this before, and they'll rail about divestment and how meaningless it is, and it's nothing but an annoyance, but then they spend the whole lunch talking about it. So it's clearly in their heads. And that symbolic significance and the signal that it sends to them at the same time when they're getting a dozen other signals in the lead up to COP26 is really important. And what I will note is that when this started 10 years ago, the Harvards of the world said, well, we'd like to do this, but it's too complicated. And again, some of the complexity, David, you'd mentioned, but now they've clearly bowed to that pressure. And in spite of it being complicated, they're saying, we're going to do this. And that there's going to be some forced public transparency around exactly how they're doing it, whether those are direct investments or they're indirect investments through private equity. So where I am today, Monday, September 27th, I think it's a something burger.
I think we'd all agree. It's something that adds up to the general social climate that makes it easier to get the fundamental political deal done, the law. So all these things make it harder, make fossil fuel companies targets, less socially credible, harder to recruit really good talent as well as money, and all those things, and give them less kind of political capital lobby. And all those mean that when the hard decisions come about legislation, the legislation is really going to change outcomes. It makes it easier for the forces that want to legislate hard to win.
All right, let's put a pin in our new newsworthy segment for today. Thanks for that. But before I do that, actually, I'm moving on. I'd forgotten I've got a couple news stories. So let me just talk briefly about them. One, and both are China-based. So one is a state-owned China green development group is beginning construction on a 3.3 gigawatt hybrid solar PV concentrated solar project. And in addition to that 3.3 gigawatts, it's adding 520 megawatts of energy storage. And I think it's significant for a couple of reasons. One, we had a price wobble at the beginning of the year on solar. Solar was cheap. It got expensive because of the polysilicon rise. It's now back to being cheap. It's also further evidence that we need of solar being the world's largest market for PV. Well, Japan and Greg Nemeth, the University of Wisconsin, has done some great work documenting how solar became very cheap. But the US played its part, Japan played its part, Germany played its part. But since 2013, China has been building plants not at the hundreds of megawatt scale. They've been building plants at the gigawatt scale. And now that they're doing storage, they're really driving down the cost of storage projects, which is what we need here in Alberta. We've shown, like the Traverse Solar Project, as one example, we can do solar PV big scale, 465 megawatts, but we can't do unsubsidized storage yet. And for big thermal jurisdictions like Alberta, if we're going to address the congestion concerns or the need for new transmission that governments have, and why some of them, including the government in this province, are now actively opposing federal investments in renewables projects, we have to address congestion and transmission projects. And that comes through storage. And the other one, this is a big one, and that's China saying that we're not going to now build new coal energy plants abroad. And President Xi Jinping made that announcement at his UN General Assembly speech, same day that President Biden talked about his climate plans. I think that's big. They've been talking under the Belt and Road Initiative of building not just ports and not just other infrastructure, but building a lot of new coal plants. And now they're saying, we're not going to do that. It's significant. Now we need China to address its own coal fleet. And that's on the order of 1,000 gigawatts. And if we're going to be at all serious about climate change, not only do we have to stop building new plants, like China said, 300 gigawatts new plants still planned. We need to take existing coal fleets, have them in the case of China or in other places, phase them out entirely.
Maybe one One just quick metric there. So the 3 gigawatts of solar, single solar installation in China, that's about 20% of the total Alberta generation capacity. So just to give people a sense of the size of and scale of that.
I think the announcement about Belt and Road and new coal is one of the most important things I've seen in climate in the last year, basically. So I really think it's very important. There were a bunch of my colleagues here who spent a lot of the last couple of years really worrying on this topic and trying to lobby for some change. And they had some estimates of the total carbon footprint of the sort of full Belt and Road initiative. This is this idea of Chinese, you can look at it as empire building or foreign aid development is somewhere in between, in my opinion, but a set of Chinese money flowing out to other countries, developing countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, et cetera, to build infrastructure. And if that infrastructure was heavily fossil, not just coal, that has huge consequences for the climate. More important maybe than anything China does on its own internals. So I think it's a very big lever. And what I hope, and I think is a reasonable thing to expect, is that this is the beginning of a change in Belt and Road. So coal was the most obvious thing, but of course, coal isn't the only fossil fuel. Mm-hmm. And the question is, does this cascade to other changes in the way funding for Belt and Road initiatives happen? And I think I really see that as one of the big pieces of climate news.
That's really interesting, David, because I think that the point that, China is clearly positioning itself as a leader in renewable energy technology means that, it's not sort of a choice between economy and environment for them if they start to steer the Belt and Road initiative into lower carbon forms of generation. And so, that is at least a possibility aligned with their, overall industrial policy.
Yeah, I think they want to do a lot of things. I think there are trade-offs, but the scale of Belt and Road, remember, is measured in like 5 to 8 trillion total spending. So it's really an amount of capital spending that dwarfs almost anything else you would think of.
Yeah, and we have to remember that this, although it's low-hanging fruit under Belt and Road to no longer to stop building or financing the building of new plants outside of China, it follows similar moves that South Korea and Japan have made. So we had this contradiction of countries like Japan and South Korea talking a good talk about phasing out their own fossil fleets, but going and through their lending arms, their international development arms, financing the construction of a lot of new plants. And we got 300 gigawatts of new coal capacity still planned. So that, I think, is the signal. We see a very clear trend. And as we say, if the international order is at all serious about coal, we have to stop building new plants. Okay, let's move us now to our next segment, which is we're going to talk about sort of what moved the dial on climate energy this summer. No surprise, we all experienced, to varying degrees, lots of heat this summer. And this is the far more than I've seen before, the links between heat and climate change, and then heat deaths were drawn by popular media. But David, I know you want to talk a bit about that.
Sure. We'll talk a little bit about heat impacts. I think it's a really important topic. So I'll just say a few words. And there's actually finally was a co-author one econometric paper on this. So big picture is if you'd asked climate experts 20, 30 years ago when I was first involved in this, what were the big climate impacts? We would have talked about agricultural impacts, flooding, a few other things, big storms, but we wouldn't have talked that much about the direct effect of heat on humans. Nowadays, I think there's a fair amount of evidence that some of the biggest climate impacts overall are the direct effect of heat on humans. And there is overwhelming evidence from a big set of studies, econometric studies that do sort of correlation analysis, that heat kills people, it reduces their intellectual productivity, and it reduces their physical productivity. So you see this in terms of gross economic output. So for example, if you just plot GDP per capita versus average temperature, you find a slope that's a couple percent per degree C. That might mean nothing because it's frozen in colonialism. It's lots of complicated things. But if you plot the interannual change, you get about the same slope. If you do it on U.S. counties inside one country, you get about the same slope. And that starts to tell you there's something real happening. So what we see from that data is that countries like Canada or Sweden actually do a little bit better on a warm year. And countries in the hot south do a lot worse on a warm year economically. We also have very clear evidence that there's actually long-term impacts on intellectual productivity. People's income is lower 30 years after they're born in a way that you could tie to exceeding 30C during the time they were in utero in the last trimester, that is a really clear signal. So there's a bunch of things like this that make it very clear. And then to tie this back to something close to a lot of us, close to all of us this summer living in Alberta, something of order, it's hard to do attribution, 1,000 people in BC died from heat. So this gives you a sense of the real scale of the impacts just beginning. And even if you look at the hurricane impacts recently in the US, there's some interesting stories that say the heat deaths were bigger than the direct deaths from storms. So I think it's worth really highlighting the importance of high temperatures in the economic and physical impacts of climate.
Two just observations to add on to that, David, because you mentioned, the different impacts in different parts of the world. And I think it ties back to this fact that there are also very different impacts, even within a given city, depending on where you live, right? And we know that parts of the city where lower income populations are higher tend to have less vegetation and higher temperatures that are located there. And so a lot of these issues that you raise, I think, are not evenly felt even by people within a given population, which is really, just kind of compounds. And I know that in the US, they're starting to look at sort of how to think about the impact, environmental justice and the impacts of ways that climate change can compound existing inequalities. And I think that's another really clear example of how that happens. Another piece that, comes to mind when we talk about the fact that, there were all these unfortunately, heat deaths in BC, is the challenge around the pace of change of climate. And this is something that, people point out for animal species, right? Of course, animals on the earth before, humans were around have undergone or have, dealt with changing climate before. But the big difference is that they deal with a climate that changes relatively slowly. And there's time for them to adapt or to basically move to, different parts of the world where the climate is more similar to what they're used to. And I think the heat is a good example of the challenges that presents for humans, right? Because, it was hot in BC, but it wasn't hotter than at a lot of places in the world that do manage, more or less to deal with some of these temperatures. I mean, there were some outliers, but it's not, it's not inconceivable that you could have a society that lives in the kind of temperatures that BC saw this summer without those impacts. But the real challenge, I think, comes in then when you getting these impacts and these heat spikes so quickly so that you haven't, it takes time for the building stock to turn over and to be built to be ready for a certain climate, or for people to have air conditioners, or for people to, be kind of adapting the patterns of daily life and the time of daily life. And so that's, I think just one of the things that makes these changes more and more challenging to adapt to.
I got to jump in. I'm so glad you mentioned the climate justice aspect. So I just weeks ago had a paper published that its title is pretty subscriptive. Heat has larger impacts on labor in poorer areas. So this was US county level data. We had the payroll data, and we had heat data, of course, temperature records, payroll data, and then we had a proxy for wealth. And the key thing that we did in the study from income tax data is that we showed, for the first time it's been done quite that way, that counties that had higher wealth had a bigger slope in the impact, bigger effect of heat on labor productivity, on wages. So basically on a hot day, people in poorer jobs are more likely to just end up not working. They can't work on a construction site or whatever. They can work in the fields, whereas people in more rich jobs are less affected. And here we see this really clearly in US data.
There's a good 2-page spread in this weekend's Globe that dove into those BC numbers. And it was astounding. They opened it by talking to a fire chief. Every fire truck in BC on one summer's night was out and not attending to fires. It was tending to people who are suffering from heat stroke, which shows, there are links between heat and fire, of course. They were lucky that they didn't have massive fires that evening because their whole fleet was in use. The article talks about how it's affecting people in the lower downtown east side. And I lived there years ago. You have people in single rooms, unair conditioned. It's like living in a sauna. They had to leave their rooms and actually go and do things like sleep in tents in parks simply to beat the heat. The other thing is, to your point, Sarah, How do we live with those impacts? Well, one of the obvious answers, and look at Oregon. Oregon didn't suffer nearly the same number of fatalities in spite of having the same heat dome effect. And that's because more people have air conditioning. So how do we live with those impacts? You could say, get air conditioning in your house. Not many Western Canadians do. More and more Western Canadians will. We can see how that compounds the problem in terms of draws on our electricity grid. And we can also see how that compounds the social injustice problem, because to be able to install AC in your house, that is not available to people of low economic means. They're going to continue to suffer from the heat. Last thing I'll say, and we're not talking enough, and having floated the St. Mary's River in BC during that heat dome, and for a guy who doesn't like cold water, I could get in there in my bathing suit, my PFD, and float down. It's a glacially fed river, and yet I was swimming in it like it was a bathtub. That is going to produce fish kills, and I think we're only just we don't have the data yet, but we're going to see massive impacts on fish stock from these heat domes. Okay, why don't we leave heat at that? It's sobering, and my concern is 20 years from now, we'll look back at the summer of 2021, and by comparison, it will seem like a cool summer. I hope that's not the case. For me, over the summer, I want to talk a bit about the IPCC Climate Change 2021 report, the physical science basis. I remember, I'll give a shout out to a Canadian author, Arno Kopecky, who's written a very good book called The Environmentalist Dilemma, Promise and Peril in the Age of the Climate Crisis. But I started to crack this book while sitting on the shores of the Kicking Horse River when it was so smoky from local fires that you couldn't see more than a few hundred meters down the river. And around the day that I was reading it was when that report came out. That report, I'd say, is both significant and insignificant. It's not newsworthy. We've all become inured to some doom and gloom science. It's like a weekly reminder of our inadequate response to climate. And it's not going to be the report that will change everyone's minds. It won't change the trajectory that we're on, which is to blow way past 1.5 C. And right now, if you tally all the national commitments, it still gets us to 2.4 C of warming at the moment. But it is significant in that the executive summary of these IPCC reports, they get a line-by-line read-through of all IPCC member countries, and that's 195. And this executive summary of the report is very explicit, as I mentioned before, about putting the blame for climate change on the burning of fossil fuels. It's very significant about some of the impacts that we're going to see on oceans, including ocean acidification, the Canadian Arctic warming much faster than the rest of the globe, sea level warming and rise. And now it's also saying that we will most likely reach that 1.C warming target threshold sometime in the 2030s. And that's significant. Principally, we talked about it earlier about China. China is committed to net zero by 2060. There's going to be pressure on China to move up that target date. And lastly, I think it's significant for any producer of fossil fuels and the accompanying CO2 or producer of methane. 83% of fossil fuel companies, oil and gas companies, are controlled by state-owned enterprises. There's very little differentiation between their corporate strategies and public policy. We've got an interesting collision looming between strategy and geopolitics. We hope to talk about it in a future episode. In Canada, we've got a Canadian government that's just been reelected. It has a new target, and it has a commitment to put a emissions limit cap on oil and gas and emissions coming from the oil and gas sector. It's been very unclear as to how it's going to do it. It puts us on a big collision course between emissions from the oil and gas sector and our national climate commitments. I don't know how they're going to do it. I was involved in negotiating the oil sands emissions limit at the provincial level. That was never put into regulation. It's very difficult when we look at the growth of the oil sands that will project between now and 2030. It will be 3.6 million barrels per day. I still don't see how we can true up our new climate target and allow that kind of emissions growth coming from the oil and gas sector.
Ed, see the chat. Are we going to a question?
I had one good news piece I wanted to share.
Yeah. Well, Sara, why don't you share your good news piece and then let's turn it over to Q&A.
Yeah, sorry that I got distracted there. I did indeed have to stop NMAX from turning the power off to my house to swap out our meter for bidirectional. I thought, what are the odds that are going to come exactly during energy versus climate to ready my new solar system that's on the roof? But there you go. So I think I've avoided that, and we'll have that happen later. But on the sort of progress note over the summer, I did want to share some news around EV adoption, because I do think that there are some signs around the pace of change picking up on some of these areas. And so when it comes to EVs in particular, the US EV sales data showed that for the month of July, 5% of all light duty vehicles, so that's everything including pickup trucks and SUVs, were electric. And 20% of cars were electric. So, you might say, well, 5%, that doesn't really sound like a lot, but that was double what it was the previous year. And at this point, there's still a very, very slim pickings when it comes to purchasing an electrified SUV or pickup truck. So, that 20% is really, I think, a fair representation out of the offering, what's there. And then, again, just to remember that the way that exponential growth works, if you have a doubling to 5% in a year, and that pace of growth were to continue, you need 4 more doublings to get to 80%. So that would be 4 more years, along that growth rate to get to 80% of all light duty vehicles in the US being electric. I guess we'll have to come back in 4 years to EVC to see if we hit that number. But on a similar note, in Norway, only about 10% of the vehicles that were sold there in the last month where data is available were non-electric. And that's down from about 20% last year. So, it's going to be hard probably to get to that 0, because that, last percent is always the hardest to go. But they seem to be marching down that growth curve pretty steadily. And so this is, I think that the adoption of electric vehicles is always like most adoptions, is always going to feel like nothing much is happening until it all is. And I think we're starting to see that signs really of that pace picking up. And if you go back in time, in 2019, a few years ago, you already had Daimler, right, one of the big motor producers, and I'll try my German here, put in Verbrennungsmotorrad Entwicklungsstopp, which is basically a stop to the production or the development of new generations of internal combustion engine design. So they, that comes the step before. Of course, you're still building the last generation. But I think the evidence is starting to pile up more and more that this is happening. So, just sort of, It often, I think, feels slow, and it is slow in the pace of, the action that we need to see to avoid the worst impacts, as Ed was talking about. But I think that there is, it's good to step back and look at where we do see that progress happening.
All right. Rather than us commenting on it, we really want to get to Q&A. We've got about 15 minutes for Q&A, and we've got David Kelly lined up.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. So question is, why are the oil and gas companies being targeted? If they had no customers, there would be no demand for the product. And the bulk of the emissions are happening at the tailpipe, a smokestack, chimney of your house. Why is that not being the target of the environmentalists?
I think it's a... Oh, go ahead, David. It's a great question. And it comes up a lot in the debate. I think it was Catherine Havo I saw recently saying something about this on Twitter, of the point of, there are certainly things that we can do as individuals to, reduce our impacts. And those are good things to do. But at the end of the day, we live within a society, that provides a set of options for us. And there's only so far that any individual can go. I can't go and construct an electric minivan if that's what I need to get around. Or in my case, I can't go and build a bike path that I can then use to, transport my kids safely if one doesn't exist. So, yes, there is the emissions come from, people's actions at the end of the day. But a lot of what what determines those actions is sort of what's available within the system. And so that's where I think, we should think about what we can do as individuals, but it's not something that any individual can really change on their own.
My view is in some ways people do over target on the fossil fuel companies. So I want to kind of take apart what target means. So one aspect is if fossil fuel companies lied, or if they deliberately told truths that were made statements that were against the public interest, that downplayed the climate risk. So on that, I think we should go after them hard. But in general, I don't think that's the core of what's happening. The core of what's happening is they're legitimately producing a product that today we need. If you turn off all fossil fuels, people are dying in the street, right? So we need this product now. And yet we understand that we can't keep using it in the long run. We must get off fossil fuels if we want a stable climate. So for me, I don't think that if it's that latter, that's targeting. There's a related version of targeting, which is if you're a regulator and you imagine you actually want to squeeze emissions out of the economy, it's much easier to squeeze the inputs than all the outputs. So if you imagine yourself writing regulations, if you want to write regulations on everybody's tailpipe, that's actually extraordinarily hard to enforce because how do you measure the tailpipe emissions? But because at least for carbon, it's a conserved quantity. It's an atom. You know that if carbon enters the economy in the form of oil and gas and coal at the wellhead or coal face, you know it'll get combusted unless it happened to go down a pipe. So it's very easy. There's a limited number of places where carbon enters the economy. So if you want to put a economy-wide carbon regulation on, not because you're targeting oil and gas, but just because you want a efficient regulation that allows high quality free market competition under a social price of carbon, you actually want to put that entire price on where it enters the economy. But that's not because you're targeting oil and gas, it's because you're trying to do something economically efficient. Everybody downstream shouldn't pay any attention to their emissions. They should just pay attention to their costs.
Yeah, I'll just add something briefly. I mean, David Kelly, I've got many friends who work for oil and gas companies, and they are good people. And sometimes they do feel like they're bearing a disproportional amount of the burden or the brunt of criticism. But if you look now at government policy and look at what the federal government has done in the last 6 years, it really is an economy-wide approach because a carbon price, industrial carbon price, low carbon fuel standards, their energy efficiency measures, their national zero emission vehicle mandates, they're not just targeting oil and gas companies, they're targeting every segment. And I can hear some of my friends who work for steel and cement producers who are screaming saying, we're just as affected by those policies as the Suncors and the Shells and the Cenovus of the world. But yeah, you go after big point source emissions. We're doing a better job of helping to convince consumers to make wise choices, but it definitely is easier to go at the input side.
But I want to come back to one last. I think there's an unfair targeting in some cases. So I think about what happened in the U.S. in the Vietnam War, where a lot of mostly wealthier people from the cities targeted the people who were fighting the war as baby killers in a way that I think had profound and terrible social repercussions. I think we got to be careful of the same thing here. So that lots of the people who are the protesters are relatively better off and more educated, and lots of people who are actually doing the work, say of mining coal or upstream oil and gas, a little less so. That's not so true in Alberta, but overall that's true. And I think it really is important to say that right now this is fuel we actually need to run our society, and the people who are getting it out of the ground are certainly not the problem.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, there's a difference between targeting in terms of, as you say, the legislation and regulation, and targeting in terms of, really being aggressive towards groups of people. I think, there's also this lumping together of individuals within the company with the action, say, of the CEOs of companies. And for example, I think that you mentioned the hurricane so recently in New Orleans, where the city lost all of its power, and a plant that had been built by Entergy, a new gas plant, basically was not able to provide power because of the loss of transmission lines. And there was a lot of, activists that were pushing for, instead of the construction of this natural gas plant, to have more solar built within the city. And basically Entergy really fought that and said that, only natural gas can provide the the reliability that we need. So I think there are, really clear examples of companies that are either, fossil fuel producers or companies that are large consumers of fossil fuels, actively preventing alternatives from being deployed. And so to me, that's where, the targeting makes some sense. But again, targeting, the actions of the leaders of the company, not the people that are doing, say, the construction or something like that, who are, not the decision makers.
All right, we're going to target Victor Dorian for the next question. Victor, over to you to talk about the German energy transition, the Energiewende.
Good morning. I'm here in Edmonton, and thank you for giving me the chance to ask my question. It's kind of a two-part question. And your show is wonderful, by the way, so I really enjoy it. My question is about the German energy transition. I'm sure you've read that they had one day when there was, or several days when there wasn't enough wind to supply German power needs. So my first part of my question is, how is Germany and other countries going to meet this energy transition challenge, given the variability of wind, especially when they're not when they're eliminating nuclear power and trying to lower coal power? And the second part of my question is, are we making enough progress in storage technologies to meet that challenge?
Sara, do you want to take the first crack? And thanks.
Yeah,
Victor.
sure. So one thing just to note on sort of what Germany is, what their power generation does look like. So it's true that there was in the early 2010s a couple of years where there was a brief uptick in the consumption of lignite and hard coal in Germany. But if you look at the overall trend, and now out to 2020, the consumption of coal, both lignite and hard coal, is falling in Germany. And actually, early on in the 90s, there was about as much nuclear as hard coal in the generation mix, and hard coal is actually lower than nuclear is today. So, it's true that there's certainly some pushback within the country, and they are dealing with challenges around phasing out the coal generation, but they are making progress there still. The question of, how do they manage variability on wind and solar? That comes back to, I think, one of our favorite topics on energy versus climate, which is transmission lines, right? So Germany is part of a broader European grid. And I think what the EU is been very clear on is that good grid integration is really key to enabling a very low carbon power grid. And so using some of the wind that's coming into other parts of Europe, or solar at times when Germany has less wind, I think it's going to be very important there. And I actually don't know. Maybe Ed or David could comment on in kind of the new plans that the EU is putting forward, the new climate plans, what kind of grid integration provisions there are there. But I think that's going to be a big part of the solution for decarbonizing the grid.
I don't know. And what Sara said, I agree with all of that. I think it's just not plausible to decarbonize on solar and wind alone in German. The power density isn't enough over all of Germany to get enough wind to really do the job. I personally think that they should, and who knows whether they will, revisit the question of nuclear phase out, because if you have a high power dense place like that and not very sunny, you need to think about carbon free sources that don't have a big footprint.
Yeah, and go back to our episode with Elizabeth May on nuclear if you want to hear a good discussion of the pros and cons. Robert Tremblay, on a related note, you've got an electricity question, but closer to home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my question is, the Liberals had net zero by 2035 clean electricity standard in the 2021 election platform. I didn't really see a lot of coverage of it, but it strikes me as something that could be really impactful to Alberta. So given that there wasn't a lot of coverage of it, how seriously should we take it as a priority from the Liberals going forward? And given that electricity is provincially regulated, should we anticipate carbon tax fights around it in the courts?
Yeah, and it's worth noting, Robert, that the Alberta NDP have adopted that similar target by 2035. So how seriously should we take it? Well, you could take it as seriously as the Liberals saying we're going to cap oil and gas sector emissions and other promises that they've made. When it comes to climate and energy, they've made lots of promises. They've delivered on most of them, but will that actually get to the emissions reductions that they want to take with them to COP26 in Glasgow? That remains to be seen. I think they're going to, on the emissions, oil and gas emissions cap, they want to take something in the shop window to COP26, and I think they're going to take that one. In Alberta, the reality is less than 10% of our electricity is generated by renewable sources right now. We still have a notional target of getting to 30% by 2030, let alone getting to this net zero grid by 2035. And that means that as coal comes offline, and that's where the Liberals have done a lot. They've got a coal phase-out target. They picked up on the coal phase-out commitment that the provincial government made prior to them. But as that comes offline, if we're going to really hit that target, you need, rather than natural gas-fired electricity backfilling that, you need renewables taking as much of a share as possible. But to do that, you need to address congestion and you need to address transmission. And right now, the provincial government is kind of loath to do that. And that's to our earlier conversation about storage, or Victor's second parter. We really need a ramp up of storage in the province if we're going to have any hope of getting there.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, right? Because I think, Robert, as you say, that the jurisdiction over the grid itself, is clearly provincial. Of course, the federal government does have the stick, if you want, around regulation of the power plants directly. So in principle, they could come in and do something on that. There's some interesting work that a colleague of mine at the U of C, Kristen Van Biesenbois, has been doing, looking at really what are the different ways that the federal government could actually exert more of the authority that they do have over things like transmission lines. And I think one of the other questions to me is how much work is that NET doing in the net zero of the electricity grid? But, I think there's also, looking at Alberta's opportunity here, there's a bit of a, to some extent, how much of a fighting of this do you do versus an opportunity, right? So there certainly could be the potential to try to go and have a constitutional fight about it and say, we don't want to go down this road. I think an opportunity version of it would be to look at it and say, okay, well, then I want the federal government to build us a bunch of transmission lines, and we're going to build out our wind and solar resources like gangbusters in Alberta. And force BC and others to trade with us to balance that variable generation. So I think there's sort of different ways that you could play it, and I think there is a mode for Alberta to play it that actually does sort of get close to that at least net zero target and provide some opportunities. Will the province do that? I mean, I don't know. I haven't checked the news in the last 10 minutes. So I don't know what's going on with the province of Alberta's politics at the moment, but I guess that remains to be seen.
Yeah, wait 10 minutes. It'll change. Good point, Sarah. David, any comments?
No, I agree with your summary. It's going to be tough.
It will be tough. Yeah, maybe that's the tagline for all the issues that we talk about. It will be tough. Okay, we thank you. We had different start time. We started on the half hour. Today, we're going to wrap up on the half hour. Just want to say
No. We were on the hour in Newfoundland.
Well, thank you. Yes, to our huge following in Newfoundland, we are on the hour for you. And we'll see if that continues. But just a quick word on the next season 3. It's going to go to June 2022. We hope to have 14 to 16 episodes, depending on availability. We're going to cover topics like the geopolitics of climate, and we'd mention how well international oil companies versus state-owned enterprises respond in the lead up to Glasgow and beyond. We'd like to do more on health and heat impacts. David gave us a teaser. I think we could spend a wonderful hour unpacking that topic. Other topics like just transition, more on storage. We should do a U.S. policy update around the anniversary of the Biden administration's win. There's lots to do on coal. Coal ain't dead yet, in spite of the China announcement, and we could do a show there. and other topics as well. So lots in store for you. Stay tuned. This episode is going to be available at energyversusclimate.com for reviewing, or as a pod, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen. Our next episode will be in about 2 weeks. Make sure you're subscribed to find out the exact time and the topic and the guest. Give us feedback, as always, on our the show generally, even our new site at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Thanks to all of you for tuning back in. Thanks to Mika, as always, for his help, and to our very patient producer, Eva Voinijescu. We'll see you in a couple weeks' time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keefe, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinijescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.